Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of History Whatevea, where we have another special guest on the show today, the host of the podcast, Norse Mythology, an unofficial guide. So happy to have him on, and hey, stick around, this is going to be a great episode. I'm really looking forward to talking a little Norse mythology. I really like this podcast. He has a great way of dissecting the subject that is Norse myth, which is very difficult one to decode as it is, and very happy to have him on. I'm excited for this episode. Norse Mythology, an unofficial guide.
John for now. But yeah, the Val thing is, that's just the Old English version of the Old Norse Val, which means like a dead body on a battlefield. It's the same word you get in like Valhalla, right?
Ah, okay. Yeah. I see. Well, that's interesting. I have really enjoyed your podcast.
Thank you.
You really do a good job of putting in context the things that are being decoded. So, like, not only do you have to bring them from the Old Norse, and you do a really good job at giving different interpretations and different translations from multiple sources, and I really find that to be key in putting together a good context for the story. Because the reason why I had you on the podcast here today is because I cannot figure out how to frame this story in any meaningful way to explain it. And you do a really good job of that. So the first question I have for you is, when you were looking at starting your podcast, Norse Mythology, an unofficial guide, where did you decide to start with that first episode? How did you bring it to that idea?
Yeah, that was actually something I thought about for a long time, where to start. And so what I ended up doing, I call it episode 0, the very first one, sort of draws a distinction between, what's the difference between Vikings, Norse culture, Norse mythology, Germanic religion, and these sorts of things, because these things are all sort of subtly different and sometimes drastically different. But they're words that often just kind of get convoluted, I think, in the popular mindset about these things. And so I figured, most people associate this stuff with Vikings. So what I'll do is I'll start by saying, once upon a time, there were Vikings, and the Viking Age was during this time, and the Vikings had this awesome religion, and they left us this mythology, and here are what the sources are, and here's how we know what that mythology is. And here are a few of the characters that we're going to be talking about, and just sort of like teeing up the rest of the show, right, by giving some context that separates what a Norse person is from a Viking, for example, and how beliefs would have been, varied across time and distance and some things like that. And that was really where I started. And then from there, the next episode, I start from basically the beginning of the mythological narrative, right? Like in a time where there was almost nothing in the cosmos, and then some characters start forming and some creation starts happening. And I did it sort of, you can't really put a really cohesive timeline on Norse mythology. You can put a loose one, though. You can put a loose one. And so I tried to follow sort of a loose timeline. Yeah.
Well, that was what I encountered. I started trying to figure out, my buddy Chris Green, he's been on the podcast before, and he started telling me that he was so interested in Norse mythology, and he was like, Thor and Odin, I love those guys.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know what, I like Norse mythology too. And I started thinking about it, how much do I really know? And then I started doing research, and I'm like, I don't know anything at all. Like, it's such a convoluted subject. Like, it's like a mythos based entirely on hearsay, and we're kind of gaining a window into it from 300 years past the time or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there are two really core sources of Norse mythology. You can source, little bits of information from lots of places, but the two main sources are both come from various versions of manuscripts that were put together around the 13th century, right? And Norse paganism is all but gone by, let's see, Sweden, I think, was the last country to fully convert, and I think that happens in the 11th century or something. So yeah, you're right. Like, these manuscripts aren't put together until centuries after Norse paganism had been replaced by Christianity. But the cool thing, though, is that one of these, they've come to be books in our time. One of these books that we call the Poetic Edda, so you can apply these really cool linguistic analysis techniques to figure out kind of a relative date for when these poems were composed. So even though they weren't, even though pen wasn't put to paper until the 13th century, we can tell that some of these poems were definitely composed, in the 900s, for example. A lot of them in the Poetic Edda come from the 900s, which is a time, we're firmly in the pagan period at that point. Although, Denmark is Christianizing around then, but Iceland doesn't convert until 1000, according to the story. So, we know that these ideas and a lot of the poetry is earlier than Christianization, but we also know that it's been modified and tweaked for various reasons and in various ways on that journey from 900 to, to 1400 or, whenever it is.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the puzzle is sort of trying to figure out and pinpoint where are the spots where we're getting corruption, if you want to call it that. And then, what might it have been without that extra layer of bias that was put on top of it. But then the other one, the Prose Edda, is a narrative guide written by a guy who's essentially a scholar in the 13th century to understanding the mythology so that you can understand the poetry, because his main interest was the poetry and how the meter works and how the poetic techniques work of this old school skaldic poetry that requires you to understand the mythology in order to understand the poetry. So he writes this book where he gives sort of this narrative, right? He invents a story of a guy who, a king who puts on a disguise, and he goes to a place in Sweden that has been named Asgard, even though it's not actually Asgard from the mythology. And he meets these wizards, and they teach him Norse mythology. He asks them questions, and they give him answers, and they tell him stories. And through this technique, the Prose Edda gives us the stories of Norse mythology. But that's the one that really, it's a guy putting his own interpretive lens on the mythology that he's been able to gather up and source from whatever manuscripts exist, from whatever poetry he's heard, right? And he's trying to condense that and give that to us. And so there's definitely mythologies out there that are, I think, harder to decipher. Celtic mythology, for example, because that one there's almost no raw mythology surviving. It's all just, medieval monks putting euhemeristic spin on ancient stories, and you have no idea who is actually an ancient hero, who might have actually been an ancient deity in these stories. It can be trickier, but it's also not quite as clear as something like Greek mythology, which has much more, I think, written down than the Norse does. Sorry, that was a really long answer to to that question.
No, I love it, because we're talking about Snorri, right?
Yeah, or who is presumed to be Snorri, right? It's actually sort of a weak association between Snorri and a lot of the Prose Edda, but there is no better candidate out there for an author, so we traditionally attribute it to Snorri.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting to me the way that's how the myths are coming down to us. Like, half poems, which are none too descriptive. They usually lack some, important descriptive characters because they're
they
poems.
Expect you to understand the religion already. Yeah.
Right. And then you have this guy from much later who has his own Christian lens that's placed on the stories that he is learning.
Yep.
But before that, there wasn't much written down at all. From my understanding, a lot of it was just retellings, word of mouth, right?
Yeah. So during the pagan period, I mean, they had writing, and there are rune stones that are carved, for example, and we know that they passed messages around, sort of like, by mail. You would carve something into a piece of wood, and then that would be delivered to somebody. So there was writing, but they didn't have a culture of robust documentation, right? They weren't documenting all the details, and they weren't establishing canon, religious canon and stuff like that.
Not like the Greeks or the Sumerians, who were very good about writing things down, even about how much grain they have and things like that.
Right. And in today's modern world, a lot of people, especially, in the United States and in Europe, our biggest exposure to religion is Christianity or Judaism or Islam, where what is correct and doctrinally factual is a big deal, right? And we have these books, and we can turn to the book, and the book is what tells us the right answer, right? And Norse paganism just wasn't like that. It was stories, as you said, being passed around, handed down from generation to generation through memorization and recitation. And poets would come along, and every one of these poems was invented for through some means, whether it's somebody just has a great idea, they think it'd make a great poem, or they're putting together like some folk belief in the area where they live, or through whatever means. All these things are just sort of growing and changing and evolving over time. And so we look at something like what Snorri gives us, and we know that he's not a Norse pagan himself. And we know that he's trying to get the story right, but we also know that he can't get it 100% right. And we can see very obviously some moments where he's not getting it 100% right. But at the same time, this idea of 100% right, what does that even really mean? There's certainly a lot of overlap between the belief of somebody in Denmark versus somebody in Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and even in the broader Germanic sense of, a pagan Anglo-Saxon or a pagan down in Germany, right? Modern day Germany at the time. I shouldn't say at the time. The conversion happened earlier in Germany and in England. But you see what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of overlap between how these people believe, but there would have been differences too. Regional variations over time. And this idea of what's 100% right becomes kind of a joke when you think about it that way, because how do you pick if the Norwegian has it better than the Icelander, or if the person from 900 AD has it worse than the person from 700 AD, right? Like those ideas just sort of start to fall apart. And the best that we can do is try to figure out, this right here, this seems like something that somebody in history probably actually believed, right? Versus these other things that are like, I don't think anybody in the pagan period probably actually believed that. But even then, it can be gray and tricky. But that's what I like about it. I like the puzzle solving aspect.
Oh, yeah. And that's what makes it so intriguing, too, is it's kind of, there's a lot of mystery surrounding it, because there really isn't 100% correct. Because what it seems to have is some sort of through line, where you have this loose association of characters that don't always behave the same way, but the stories are almost in line. Like the story itself is what creates the through line, but in different places it's interpreted differently and told differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I often I've sort of come to think of it as like a big sequence of memes, if you will. It's right. It's like these like motifs and these tropes. Yeah, but it's like these motifs and these tropes that just keep popping up all over the place that are culturally or religiously important, and so you see them repeated. Things like the number 9, right? You could think of it as like the meme of the number 9. It's just everywhere. There's a collection of something. There's 9 of them. Unless it's a small collection, then it's 3. But that's only because 3 times 3 is 9, right?
Right.
So it's just this whole religion built on some like set of really important ideas that just pop up and are used to create these narratives, and they have purpose in terms of reinforcing what proper behavior is in society, right? So like a lot of it exists to remind you, for example, as a man, how a man is supposed to behave, or remind you as a homeowner how you're supposed to behave towards a guest, right? A lot of Havamal, for example, talks about how the proper etiquette when dealing with guests at your house, for example. And these things, and it's funny because in the modern world, we think about religion as being this sort of separate, self-contained thing that exists maybe outside of the secular world that we live in. You know, for example, I could go to church on Sunday, and then that could be, you know, my entire religious experience for a whole week. And the whole rest of the week, I could not think about anything religious or divine at all. And I can do that in 2023. But if you go back to, let's say, 800, what is it that separates religion from everyday reality? You know, in any given detail. You know, I look around and I see a tree, but that tree is part of a sacred grove, you know, and that, I don't know, that tree is tied to some deity, for example. You know, I see a mountain in Iceland. I see, what was it? Helgafjell or something. And I believe that when I die, I'm going to join my ancestors in that mountain, you know, like just everything about, or, you know, I go to a party and there are drinks being served a certain way that mimics the way that the gods hold their drinking ceremonies, you know, and it's just like everything is connected. The way that I do everything, it's in my farming, it's in my speech, it's just connected to everything. And so I don't know, all of this stuff is, now I've forgotten exactly why I started talking about this.
Well, I'm bringing it back because I've been
bring it back for me.
I'm following you here.
Yeah.
One of the episodes you describe, because we were talking about the manner of which you treat guests in your home.
Right.
One of those was Thor, or I believe it was Thor who had the goats, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he was given a place to sleep for the night, and he's like, "Hey, you can eat these goats. They're gonna come back. It's all good. Just don't mess with the bones."
Right.
And they messed with the bones, and then it was like, well, now you're gonna pay the price. And that's one of those stories that, you know, maybe went from father to son, and when you hear someone rapping at the door, you think, oh, well, not only do I want to be respectful to my guest who's here and greet them in the proper fashion, but I also want to make sure that I give them the respect they deserve even while they're in my home, because that's very important to the person in those times who believes deeply in the mythos that we're talking about. Like, it's not something you can just step outside of. It's there all the time.
Right.
And it's one of those qualities that makes like the trope of the Viking what it is. You know, they always have this idea that they will die in battle and they will join Oden in Valhalla, you know? Or I'm trying my best to actually give it the pronunciations, but I'm just hearing the Marvel pronunciation in my head.
Right. I'm totally fine with saying Odin and Valhalla and stuff. I know on my show, I try to do Old Norse pronunciations. I'm not perfect at it, but yeah, I do say things like Valhall and Odin, for example. But now we're in having a conversation, that's just going to confuse people most of the time. I know that. So, yeah.
Yeah, give me some of the spaghetti. You know, it's not exactly necessary.
Right.
But these, and they show up again and again. One of my favorite episodes is, of course, the one where Thor wears a dress, right?
Right, yeah.
And I think you do a great job with that, because you give a good kind of historical context before trying to deliver a retelling of the story. And the retelling of the story, you know, we're saying 100% correct or not 100% correct, but I like we said earlier, I just don't think that those things actually matter, because no one would have ever told the story the same way twice. They had that through line that they talk about, you know, the behavior that you are supposed to exhibit as a male in Norse society.
Right.
But they give these stories of what's good and what's not good, and sometimes you can break the rules if it's necessary, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. I love that story for similar reasons. You know, we mentioned a couple times now this idea that manliness is an extremely important value in Norse society. And if you fail to adhere to manliness, you can suffer the worst kinds of social consequences and sometimes legal consequences, right?
Yeah.
But it's amazing. That story is amazing because even though we don't always see the gods behave according to standards that are set out by, the social writings that we have, law codes and stuff. It's that one in particular is amazing because you can just sort of imagine yourself being a Norse man inundated with this idea that you have to be manly all the time, right? It's not just the men telling you that; it's the women too.
Right,
if your wife sees you running away from a battle, she's going to be extremely mad at you, and she's going to tell you to go back and fight like a man, right? There's recorded attestations of things like this, but then you see Thor making a decision to violate a serious cultural taboo for the time, an extremely serious one, that would have allowed his wife to divorce him, for example, legally. And he does it because it's explained to him that, the giants have, the Jotnar, the so-called giants, have gotten his hammer. And if he doesn't get it back, that is potential calamity for the entire cosmos, right? All of creation is now in peril because of this. And the one who can see the future speaks up and says, Thor, you got to put on a dress. And, he protests at first, but then he comes to accept it because he knows he has to do it, because what Thor is above all else is the defender of creation, the defender of humanity. Right, he's the preserver of order in the universe, and so he has to get the hammer back by any means necessary. And I just imagine myself being a Norse man and thinking, what would I do in that scenario? Right, under what circumstances would I put on a dress because I had to? And just sort of like thinking that you could imagine guys sitting around a fire and just like conversing philosophically about that idea on its own for hours. When's it okay? When's it not okay? And I love trying to wrap my head around the idea of the meaning these stories would have had for real people that were experiencing them.
And what sticks out to me is the fact that what seems to be reinforced throughout that story is the fact that you should never lose your weapon.
Yeah, right. That's a good point.
It's so important for you to never lose your weapon, especially to the enemy, because, he could still smash the Jotnar, just not as good without his hammer. And that's like his main occupation is out there just taking care of these problematic characters. And since he lost his weapon, even though he is the great and mighty Thor, he still, all right, fine, I'll listen to you. We're going to go get this back. And somehow this guy is fooled by, a bearded character in a dress who's like, this isn't Thor, is it? And it makes you wonder.
That's the comedy of it. And that's what I love about it. It's such a fascinating juxtaposition between comedy and this sort of like really intriguing, thought-provoking social commentary, and that's what's so great about comedy. And I know that you're into the comedy scene, and so surely this is something that you think about a lot, right? But this is what I love about comedy is that comedy gets to deal with like really sensitive subjects in really insensitive ways. And I know that that's been a little bit trickier in the past few years, but I think ultimately that concept still applies. Comedy is the place where we're supposed to be able to laugh at the joke that's at our own expense because the next joke is at the next guy's expense, right? And it's supposed to give us perspective and a new way of looking at the world and a different way of seeing things without making us, I don't know, hate the environment we're in. Instead, we really enjoy it. And it's a fascinating thing that happens.
Well, in comedy is so strange, and that's actually another reason why I enjoy your podcast, because you have a good sense of humor, and you throw in some good jokes once in a while that are based on the subject, and I really enjoy that kind of thing because that's kind of what I do as well. Mm-hmm. But it's always like if you can hit that button in somebody's brain and make them laugh, it's because you've made some sort of a connection to a real idea. Like
relatable things are funny, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's basically all of comedy is finding
Yeah.
what is relatable about that. And I was thinking about this, and it's sort of like, Odin, Thor, and Loki walk into a bar, right?
Yeah.
That's what's, because that is another story that I really liked that you do the telling of. And that's where I couldn't put it back together in my mind exactly how this
Sure.
goes, but you've got Odin sitting next to Loki at the bar, and he's just talking trash. And then all of a sudden, he's like, "You wouldn't be talking like that if Thor were around." And
Oh,
then,
right,
boom,
right. Yeah.
Thor is around. And I just find that story to be so interesting too, because nobody says really much to Loki, even though he's sitting there just throwing down the worst insults he could go for until Thor shows up, and he's like, "Well, Thor's the only one who could actually beat me, so all right, whatever." He says a few more things, and that's it.
Yeah, it's awesome, right? Loki is not scared of anyone in that entire room until Thor comes in. And it illustrates one of the cool tropes about Thor too, which is that if you say his name, he shows up. And that's something we see kind of scattered around Norse mythology, is that you can kind of invoke the presence of something by saying its name. And we see that in particular with Thor. And Loki sort of like makes the mistake of mentioning Thor kind of near the end of the poem. And then it's like, oh, here he comes, and people
Right.
are hearing like the loud sounds outside of probably his chariot, crashing through the air or whatever. And then, yeah, but even then, Thor has to threaten Loki, I think, 4 times before Loki finally is like, okay, all right, I'll leave.
Yeah, and I love that too, because there's always something like that. Even Buddha can only be patient 3 times, and
Yeah.
from a more Christian perspective, there's the older idea of speak of the devil and he shall appear.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
kind of law of attraction, and some of this is being portrayed through these stories, much like in the Christian Bible. You see some of these stories that illustrate bigger ideas that are supposed to teach you a lesson. And that's exactly what I see in these. And one of the coolest things that I've found about Norse mythology is that it's sort of laid into our culture everywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't realize it. I'm a big Tolkien fan. I've read The Hobbit so many times. I own the super nerdy edition, extended edition of the movies, and I'm disappointed in the movies that The Hobbit put out. But if you, I hate that redheaded elf bitch. Anyway, those stories, elves, dwarves, magic weapons.
Yeah.
These ideas are laid into our culture, and they're kind of in the background. You sort of have to look for the symbolism, and you find it in places that you didn't know. Like, until I started doing research into Norse mythology, I really didn't know that basically all of the pieces of Tolkien's story, which most of fantasy is built off of today, come from Norse myth.
Yeah, it's really cool how that works. I mean, just a second ago, I'm not a Christian historian, or even really a folklore historian, or any kind of historian, really. But
Yeah,
you mentioned a second ago this "Speak of the devil and he will appear," right? And it immediately makes me wonder. I'd need to go look it up, but it makes me wonder: is that something that originated in Christianity, or is that something that Germanic people who already had this idea that you could have invoked something by saying its name applied to Christianity after conversion, right? Like, yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised to see it go either way, to be honest.
I really think that's a much older lesson that probably comes from a place where we have no record of, because it's kind of just an actual truth, of some sort, it seems.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But yeah, in other, I guess from other angles, I think I've alluded on the show a couple of times to this idea that Sleeping Beauty is largely inspired by the saga of the Volsungs, specifically Sigurdur. He has to slay a dragon, then he has to go through a wall of fire, and then he has to wake up a sleeping princess / Valkyrie. Right?
Yeah.
That's just Sleeping Beauty. And then, and as you said, like, Tolkien's main inspiration for this stuff is Norse mythology, and one of the reasons or one of the things that kind of draws me to it is specifically that. Right. So you mentioned being a Lord of the Rings nerd, and for me, this is a similar kind of a thing. When people ask me why I enjoy Norse mythology or why I do the podcast or whatever, I say, some people know all the Star Wars lore. Some people know all the Tolkien lore. Norse mythology is that for me. I'm just being a huge nerd, and just that's the one that I picked. Right. But the reason why I picked it is because this is not to disparage Tolkien or anything. I think his work is amazing. But, Lord of the Rings is a guy's invention, right? And Star Wars is a guy's invention. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what's different about Norse mythology is that this was a lived reality religiously for a lot of people for a very long time, that this enormous sort of like umbrella culture participated in creating and evolving, right? And that's what I love about it. It's this idea that, this was real for people, like Thor isn't just a story that we tell our kids for fun and like make a Disney movie out of. He's like, you hear that clap of thunder, that's because Thor just killed something. Maybe, or like it could have been, how they perceive thunder could also be his chariot or whatever. But my point is that like this stuff is really going on for these people. And that's what to me is so amazing. And then the second layer of it was there was a moment where I had this realization that Norse mythology isn't just Norse, right? Linguistically, these words are shared amongst other Germanic speaking people. And religiously, these concepts are shared amongst Germanic-speaking people. There's a find, I think it was at Sutton Hoo in England. I think somebody's gonna call me on this being wrong. Material culture is my weak point, but there's a helmet, and it's one of the, if I remember correctly, one of the eyebrows, because it's sort of like they kind of like ornate, they like carve ornamentation on it, and one of the things is eyebrows. And over one of the eyes, I believe, if I remember correctly, it had like a bunch of jewelry and stuff, and then the other one didn't. And the idea is that in firelight or something, you would see the one eye glinting, but not the other one. And it's theoretically an allusion to this idea of Odin, right? And him being only one-eyed. And so you start to see these kinds of things all over the Germanic-speaking world. The Merseburg charms from Germany are the second one in particular, the same formula is repeated in some stuff that we found in Sweden, for example. And you start to realize, wait a second, Norse mythology is just one little sliver of that was preserved of this religion that was actually practiced in much broader territory, right? And then of course, like I'm an American, so I can't help but relate things to my ancestors, because that's what we do, and the Europeans make fun of us for it, right? But it makes me realize, like, even though I'm only like, just a tiny bit Scandinavian, I'm very, very English in ancestry. And you realize that the Anglo-Saxons believed in these same things. And then all of a sudden it's mine just as much as it's anybody else's. And then, of course, there's the realization that nobody owns mythology. It belongs to everybody, right? Everybody across the world has like equal like right to these stories and stuff. But, like there's just some connection there. You realize that somebody somewhere in your family tree believed in these things too, and it just draws me in a little bit more.
It kind of reminds me of being really, a small child, and there's a heavy rainstorm going outside, and there's thunder, and it's raining real hard, and there's lightning claps, and my parents just said, "Oh, it's gonna be all right. Don't worry about it." See, a Viking child probably would have been told something like, "Oh, that is just Thor up there. He's protecting us. He's smashing the Jotnar, and someday you'll be able to go out and fight yourself and have heart, that kind of thing."
Yeah.
Enforced from the very beginning.
Yeah, because you turn this thing that is otherwise sort of intuitively terrifying, right? Like thunder, and especially when it's right overhead, right?
And
Like
you have no concept of what that really is.
And then it turns into this idea of that's the God who's protecting us. Right?
Right.
It turns it into this idea of a terror-inducing thing to something that's almost comforting. Right? You hear that because he's out there doing his job, answering prayers and smiting those Jotnar that are afflicting people with disease. And, it's like, imagine being a little kid and your dad has some kind of infection or something, and he goes to see a seeress, or some kind of a sorceress type person, and he gets a little copper charm that talks about like Thor killing the Jotun that's afflicting him with this disease, and then there's a thunderstorm, and it's like maybe he's saving my dad. Like people are relating to this stuff in those kinds of ways, and I don't know. To me, I love thinking about that.
Well, and life in those times was so unbelievably short.
Yeah.
That if you didn't. I believe it was your podcast, and you kind of describe it where it's like I think it was relating to the Christian Jesus, where there was stories told about, oh no, Jesus, he actually climbed up there himself. He was ready to go and meet it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was the kind of thing that a lot of these people would have come up with. I wanted to say young men, but it wasn't always young men. There were young women who went and fought too, and they would have believed the same thing, where it's like, I'm going to go up here and meet my fate in battle, and I'm going to do it gleefully, and if I survive, it's because my fate wasn't today, and if I die, well, then my fate was today. And that was one thing that made them so fierce and had such great energy in combat, and why people didn't really want to go up against them hand to hand, because they were like, you want to kill me? Let's do this. It's my day to die. Come on.
Yeah, I think it was Caesar who actually wrote something about how the Germanic people that he went up against were unique in that they had no fear of death, because I think, if I remember correctly, the way he explained it was that in his belief, the people that he was dealing with specifically believed that they were all just going to be reincarnated again. And so they were cool to just die, right? Just run out there and die. Yep. And that made them unique. And it's interesting. And this is also, this is another reason why I have kind of an interesting relationship with retellings. Because on the one hand, like we've been saying, there's no canonically accurate version of any of these stories. But at the same time, if you are far enough removed from the culture where they originate, then you run the risk of retelling the stories and getting the memes wrong. Does that make sense? So for example, there's this idea of Oden and Ragnarok. So Oden is supposed to die at Ragnarok. He gets eaten by the wolf Fenrir. And what happens in sort of like the traditional like short version of the story is that warriors die in battle, and then they go to Valhalla and they join Odin's afterlife army called the Einherjar. And all they do is they just feast and fight all day, every day, and they they get killed and then resurrected and then go have dinner and then just do the same thing again the next day, so that when Ragnarok comes, Odin has this big army. And the modern mind immediately goes, if Odin is gathering up an army for Ragnarok, then maybe he thinks he can overcome his fate, because he's been fated to die. It's been prophesied, right? It's his fate. Right. And so you go, maybe he's trying to push this off for as long as he can, or maybe he's trying to get enough warriors that he can overcome his fate and actually win. But if you understand the Germanic warrior mindset well enough, then you start to realize, no, like you were just saying, what you're supposed to do is, even though you know you're fated to die, you're supposed to walk into it triumphantly and go out in a blaze of glory, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And from that perspective, now we have to call into question this idea of like Odin thinking that he can overcome his fate or forestalling Ragnarok or whatever, because it becomes more like an Occam's razor solution that he's just trying to make sure he goes out in the biggest blaze of glory he can, because that's what you're supposed to do as a Germanic warrior. And we see that repeated countless times throughout throughout the mythological sources and the sagas especially. I think that must have showed up 100 times when I was going through Volsunga Saga, right? So that to me is the trick. And I don't go so far as to say people shouldn't do retellings, but I often find myself just telling people, well, if you're going to read a retelling book, just be wary and know that you're going to come away from it with like a few misconceptions, you know?
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think that's okay. That's a totally okay starting point. My very first book was kind of like that. And a lot of people get into this through reading Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, which is also like that. He does a great job, but you also come away from it with some misconceptions. And it's good, I think, at some point if you get serious enough to read the Eddas, you know? Once you kind of get an idea for the basics, they're pretty approachable.
Well, and it's kind of something you almost... Like, I kind of discovered this idea that basically Norse mythology is somewhat like, you know, between 500 and 1,000 years of telephone.
Yeah, I would say it's
You know,
even more than that, but yeah, definitely.
probably is more than that, because what we see are a lot of these old Germanic traditions, and they're probably come from who knows where, but they still come down through the ages, and they survived Christianity because they couldn't quite get rid of them. It seems that the Christians just sort of enveloped the things they couldn't get rid of, like the Yule log. You know, I did some research on Christmas, and that was one thing that they couldn't really get rid of. People would just still do the Yule log, and they would have Yule, and they just started calling it Christmas. And
Right.
that's one of the most cool things, one of the most intriguing things about mythology is the fact that somehow, even though they tried so desperately, and the same with the Celts, to stamp it out entirely, there was just no way to get rid of the ancestral memory and how people told stories. They would sometimes put a lens on it that would give it a Christian feel, but it was still that same base story that people have been telling for ages and ages to,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. Like, on that vein, you know, Easter is named after a Anglo-Saxon pagan goddess, and it's a Christian holiday that bears
Right.
a pagan goddess's name, right? I think the commonly accepted theory is that like the rabbits and the eggs and stuff are also just part of like the older pagan tradition that just kind of got adopted in. So yeah, it's amazing how people have done this. And you brought up Jesus climbing the cross, which is something that happens in Dream of the Rood, which is another Anglo-Saxon poem. And the reason I brought up that poem mainly in that context, the first time when I went through it on the show, was to show how this idea of the primordial tree is able to survive in Christianity by connecting it to the cross, right? So that whole poem, Dream of the Rood, is about this guy who has a dream, and he ends up talking to this glorious tree, and the tree tells this story about how it was a tree in a forest, and then it was cut down and fashioned into the cross that they put Jesus on, and everything that happens to Jesus also happens to the cross, right? They nail his hands into the cross, so both Jesus and the cross feel the nails, right? So he's experiencing everything Jesus is feeling. Jesus gets put into the tomb, the cross gets thrown into a pit, Jesus gets resurrected, and now here is this guy having a vision of the cross back in tree form again, essentially resurrected. And then he closes out the poem by saying he's going to pray to the cross so that it will be the one that shepherds him into the afterlife, right? And it's this obvious way of keeping this like ingrained cultural idea of tree veneration around through the lens of Christianity, right? Okay, trees are still cool because you got to make crosses out of trees, right? And in this way, we can kind of keep it for a while.
Oh, and houses and chariots and whatnot, you know,
Yeah,
the yoke
yeah, exactly.
to pull the plow, all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in trees, that's sort of like this druidic reverence that, you know, and that's probably why we have so much of this spread around in, you know, European culture, is because the Romans did so much to not only transport groups of people, but you just, that army would absorb anyone they came across, and they brought their own ideas, their own mythos into it. And for most of the Roman Empire, they were cool with that. You worship whoever you want. As long as you're subservient to Rome, we don't care. And it was like an insurance. I've heard someone say it was like insurance against the afterlife. So it was like, hey, we're cool. We let everybody in. And then later on, it turned into a strictly Christian thing, and they started to try to stamp out the Norse, the Germanic, the pagan, the Celtic, anything like that. There were entire campaigns launched against them. And maybe that's why some people held on to the ideas and the stories so doggedly, even after being, quote unquote, converted, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, anytime somebody is force converted, they are typically in secret holding on to their own beliefs. This is why, I mean, I'm not going to get into that territory. I'm going to be totally wrong. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go that far outside my comfort zone. So never mind. But
all right. Well, we are, we're not historians. I am a comic.
Yeah. But it's, and the Christianization of the Germanic people is interesting because it happens in different ways at different times in different places. We talk about the Saxons being, I believe it was Charlemagne who kept trying to subject them and force Christianity upon them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then, once you get past the 800s or so, Scandinavia starts voluntarily adopting Christianity because, and the classic book that everybody should read about this one is The Conversion of Scandinavia by Anders Winroth. But the short version of the story is that the leaders in Scandinavia are smart enough to recognize the economic and political benefits to converting to Christianity. And of course, Europe is more than happy to send all the missionaries you could want up into Scandinavia. But it stops
more
being,
than you want.
Yeah, but it stops being a forced conversion in large part. Not to say that there was never any strife or turmoil or upset, because, surely there was. But we move from a state of some king just violently subjugating people into Christianity into one where, different groups of people are sort of starting to voluntarily adopt it. They've been exposed to it for a really long time. Number one interesting thing about Germanic paganism is that it doesn't have this idea that my gods must be right and therefore your gods must be fake. And so, you see that there are these people believing in this Jesus guy, and maybe you have whatever thoughts you have about whether or not Jesus is a good God to worship, but there's nothing in your religion that tells you to think he's not real or can't be a real God, And so from that angle, it's easier to adopt, I think. And then especially if your king has gone for it, and all the nobles in society and all the people that you look up to are going for it for the political and financial benefits and stuff. Yeah. It just over time it sets in, and it takes over.
Well, the Vikings were. It's interesting hearing some of the stories because it's if you give us enough silver, we'll leave you alone for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I could see how maybe there's this idea of Jesus just sort of being a part of the pantheon because, like you said, there's no hard and fast rules. And people like Odin, even though he was the top of the food chain in Norse mythology, he still was a bit fallible. He couldn't see everything. He had to give something up to gain wisdom, his eye. He had crows that would fly around and be his eyes and ears, but they weren't all seeing. We talked about some of Thor's faults and some of the stories he had to get through. He couldn't just snap his fingers and change everything. He wasn't infallible, and then you have Loki, who's sort of this. He's so fluid, he can change his shape. He's in so many stories. He gets all these attributes that could be that's a very interesting character, Loki.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
I mean, it makes sense why, maybe because of the political and financial gains, because, Christian nations were very big and wealthy, and there's a lot of trade to be done. Yeah, why not? Yeah, I'm cool with that. We can do a little conversion for some silver. It doesn't seem out of the realm of possibility that it just became, hey, I'd like to have a little peace and a little good trade, don't have to go out and raid every year. I can see how it's not that bad.
Oh yeah, there are historical examples of, for example, two armies at war with each other. One of them's pagan, one of them's Christian, and the end result when they finally make a truce and the war is over is that the pagan gets baptized, and it's part of the sort of like truce deal, stuff like that happens.
Yeah, maybe they were all out of daughters to trade or something. I don't know.
Well, it's funny, historically, and even still in a large measure today, it's very important in the Christian mindset that others adopt Christianity. And that's because, so one thing to understand about me too is that I don't have academic training in humanities, but I did, my first major in college was anthropology. It's not what my degree is in, but I feel like I learned a lot about trying to understand people through their own point of view from my anthropology coursework. And so, if you look at it from the Christian point of view, what's going on is that you honestly believe that people who are not converting to Christianity are setting themselves up to be in like a really bad place in the afterlife. And so your desire to convert them is you trying to give them this gift that they maybe don't understand why it's such an important thing that you understand in your own mind, right? And then, but in order to live in a society that's not, like in the United States, we have a secular government, or we ostensibly have a secular government. You have to figure out ways to live in that context and still, so you still end up trying to talk to people about it if it comes up, and still try to share this idea with people. And it's interesting to watch as society drifts further and further away from this idea of like allowing themselves to be proselyted to, right? And just to see kind of that paradigm shift over time, because, like we're saying, back in the Middle Ages, this was just, we're converting entire countries, yeah. Right?
Yeah, by the sword, idea. Yeah.
But it doesn't quite work that way anymore.
No, yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why this is such a difficult subject, is because our lens as modern people is so far removed from anything close to a lifetime that they would have seen.
Yeah.
I mean, even 300 years after that, we have no real frame of reference. We have to do much research in order to get some type of context to understand what the people might actually have been thinking, putting yourself into their shoes, because our lives are just so much different than anything they would have encountered. I mean, plowing the fields and, maybe seeing someone stabbed to death was not something that was out of the ordinary. Like, right. You may have actually stabbed a lot of people to death, and you were celebrated for that. Hey, do you want to see my trunk full of skulls? It's a different time frame. Like, to any of us, if we were invited into somebody's home and we're like, this guy's great, and he's like, you want to see my trunk full of people I conquered? It's like, right. I think I'm good. I actually should go.
Yeah. But yeah, I certainly would not, if I time traveled today back into, 800 AD, put me somewhere in Northern Europe, I'm dead real quick. That's for sure.
You gotta, the food could kill you. The water could kill you.
Yeah.
You might just show up in funny clothes and they call, they kill you for that. Or dying was just something that could happen so swiftly in those days. I mean, that's why people had so many kids. They knew a few of them weren't going to make it and they needed help in the fields. Mm-hmm. And, maybe that's why the culture of Vikings and the Norse mythology that accompany them is so entrenched into sort of this collective past that we all sort of feel, because whether or not you were, your ancestry would be linked back to some of the peoples that would do the raiding on the long ships and come down the river and show up in your town out of nowhere, or if you're on the receiving end of that that is a collective sort of experience that our ancestors had to deal with these incredibly scary and like shock troops in the ancient times. I can only imagine what that must have been like. One day it's nice and peaceful. The next day, for an hour, you just are completely destroy everything. They take everything, they kill a bunch of people, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that would create a bit of a myth and legend of its own of these people, right?
Yeah, and then what do you do? Do you just stay there, and then 2 years later they come back and do it again? It's crazy to think about.
And I wonder how many of them would have survived 2 years. I assume that the turnover rate on a Viking ship was rather high.
Yeah, it's interesting. I described it, I think, in episode 0. I think I used the word job, and it's a tricky word because I don't know how often going out on Viking voyages was the exclusive occupation of a person, right? In a lot of cases, there were people that weren't doing that, right? But there's certainly documentation leading us to believe that there were people who would do other things, during the winter months, and the fall and harvest season. But then come springtime, it's like, all right, now there's an opportunity to like go out there and make myself a little bit richer than I was last year. And so maybe you change occupations for the summer and, and see how it goes. And you may be wildly successful, or you may not be at all. The Vikings are often remembered as these fierce, like unbeatable warriors. And I'm not to say that they weren't fierce warriors, but when we look at how the Vikings behaved, what we see is that when they came to very poorly defended places, they would raid them. And when they came to places that looked like they might put up a pretty substantial fight, they would just offer to trade instead. And these would become trading hubs. And then later when we see larger armies being pulled together from Scandinavia and, fighting other armies from Europe, sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. And it comes down to, who's got the geographical advantage, who's got the better weapons, who's got the higher numbers, it's really fascinating because on the one hand, we've been romanticizing them since the 13th century,
Yeah.
But they're not supermen. They're humans, and so there's that aspect of it too.
Oh, and that's something that still it's very relatable to everyone, because we understand that they were very well acquainted with this thing that we called like death, and we're all kind of you can't really not think about it. But it seems like the Norse mythos really puts you in a position to be okay with it. Because it's, could come right now. Your fate is what it is, and you should meet it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. If I'm a early medieval Scandinavian, there's a great chance that I currently have some kind of a stomach parasite. Like death is coming for me for sure. And the average lifespan of the time is not whatever it is today, 75 or 80 or whatever. It's definitely much shorter.
No, you were a wizard if you were 40. My God,
Yeah.
I think that's a description that I may have taken from Dan Carlin at some point of hardcore history. But, it is a great way to put in perspective, because, these days we look at somebody who's like 90 and we're like, wow, old. But I mean, the chances of someone actually making it to an age like that back in those days was slim to none. I mean, you just didn't last that long,
Yeah, you read the sagas and they talk about, and then so-and-so was becoming an old man by this point, and you're like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. He was 30.
Was he approaching his late 30s, or was he 60? Like, what do you mean by he was an old man? That could mean anything.
Yeah, and they even had these in Rome, they had like you had to be a certain age to obtain office, and if you think about it, in order to obtain office, you also had to serve time in the military, in the Roman army. Mm-hmm. So if you made it to 35, you were a badass. Like, you have survived many a battle, and you have overcome much hardship, and you're doing pretty damn good. Like, so it's interesting how much perspective is needed in order to decode this thing we call Norse mythology. Because, I mean, what we've basically gone over from this whole podcast so far is that when you have the historical perspective right, and you have a context that gives you the correct lens to view it, these stories take on a different kind of view, and they're interpreted differently by everyone who reads them, but they do have that same through line of lessons that generally, are somewhat the same, I guess.
Yeah, and it's fun too, because the lessons taught by the mythology, in a lot of cases, I should say, the overt lessons taught by the mythology are not the types of lessons we would necessarily want to be teaching each other today. For example, Havamal says things like "Don't trust women," and I think it even says the reverse too. Like, also women, you shouldn't trust men either. But and it's like if you're a man, you got to behave a certain way, and we have this mean name that we call people that fall afoul of gender roles, and that is the correct behavior by their standards. But like you're saying, in modern times, we're still completely able to look at these stories and pull other types of lessons out of them that are still relevant. There's the story where Thor makes the journey to Geirrodr's house, and he has to cross a river, and while he's crossing the river, one of this Jotun's daughters stands astride the river, and she pees into it, making it rise, and then he has to throw a rock at her to get her to stop. But there's this moment in the poem where he says this really poetic thing to the river, right? Where he's like, don't even bother trying to rise, river, because if you do, then the strength in me is just going to rise to match, and I'm going to beat you anyway, right? And I love that line, because you can apply it to any kind of challenge in life, right? And you can imagine yourself as Thor trying to cross this river and things conspiring against you. And you can say to yourself what Thor says to himself, or to the river in that case, like, it doesn't matter how much you rise to challenge me, because my strength is going to rise equally. Right. And there's really cool stuff in there that we can apply to ourselves that I don't know. I think it's great.
Well, that also, to me, it seems like if that story were being told around a fire, that it wouldn't be told with a very serious, stern attitude. I think there's some humor in there.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, she's peeing in the river, and then Thor just picked up a rock and was like, zing, and like, I'll rise any pee you want. It's kind of...
Right. Yeah, the way that moment is told is hilarious, too, because she's peeing in the river to make it rise, and Thor says, quote, "At its source must a river be stemmed." He throws the rock, and Snorri says, and he didn't miss what he was aiming at.
Right? Yeah, that could be
he throws the rock and he stems the river with it.
Yeah, where did that rock really land? It's not really described. It's sort of left up to the your imagination a little bit.
But this is the way Snorri talks, right? Snorri, he has to imply stuff, because now he's in this sort of like this weird, it's not as sort of like linguistically sensitive as a time that we're in now, but there's like religion, Christianity pervasive in his society, and he has to talk about things a certain way, and we don't talk about certain things too much,
No, because that's your head.
Yeah, because he alludes to things, right? He'll say things like, so Loki turned into a mare and he whinnied at the other horse, Swaddlefari, and so Swaddlefari broke his chains, and the horses chased each other all night long, and then later on, Loki had quote, such conduct that he gave birth to a foal, right? And that's how Snorri talks. But then in the Poetic Edda, where we get some of the more raw mythology with these poems that are composed earlier on, you get things like Loki saying stuff to Njord, like shut up, Njord. Like, remember that time you let those 3 women pee in your mouth? And like it's very different type of stuff.
It's, and that they weren't devoid of humor. And one other story that I really enjoyed was where Thor goes on this excursion and he runs into a giant, and this giant tricks him over and over and over again. Yeah. He's like smashing him in the head, and he's like, "Oh, is that an acorn?" And then he goes and he's like, "Oh yeah, anybody could drink this much," and he ends up, and they're just tricking him the whole time, even though he's like drinking up the ocean. And it's such a great story because there's also a bit of humor in there.
Yeah,
because it keeps it interesting for the telling around the fire.
Yeah, it's got to be entertaining to be passed on.
Absolutely. And it has a great story too, because, Thor knows he's pretty badass and he can drink and eat a lot and he can wrestle real good. And he's like, I just don't understand what's going on here.
Yeah.
It's because he was really dealing with illusions the whole time.
Right.
And it sort of points at this thing where it's like, well, you do the best you can, even though you're losing, because it might not be true that you're losing. Something along that line there. But that's a great story. I really appreciate that episode as well.
Yeah, I like that one too. That's I think there's this idea in kind of the modern pop cultural mindset about Thor that he's dumb. And he's not dumb at all. But we have sort of this cultural meme in modern times that a person can either be strong or smart. But our characters in our stories are rarely both strong and smart, right?
Yeah.
But it was a value for the Norse. Like, the ideal Norse man is both strong and smart. And Thor is nothing if not the ideal Norse man. And so that, but I think people point to that story a lot and say, like, he was so dumb that he didn't realize he was drinking the ocean or whatever. But it's funny because, we like to think of Loki as a very clever character, but Loki is right along Thor the entire time, getting tricked by every single trick that is fooling Thor.
Right.
And it's in that way, it's kind of a reminder too, that like nobody is so smart that they're never going to be tricked, not Thor, not Loki. Like, it can happen to anybody.
Yeah. And that's supposed to be, quote unquote gods in their idea. And it's strange that Christianity somehow did away with that and people were still okay with it. Or maybe it was just like a translation over time thing, but this monotheistic idea. But, I've had you on here for quite a while now, and we've gone over a lot of different subjects. And, hey, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and let people know where they can find you.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you for having me on. So my show is Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. It's on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon, everywhere that you might get a podcast from. And then I also upload to... I upload the same show to YouTube, but recently I have started experimenting with doing some more YouTube-specific content. I have an extremely boring, linguistic-focused, nerdy video on there now about reconstructing how Oden's name ought to be pronounced in modern English if it had never left the common vernacular centuries ago, which to me is super interesting, but it's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. But that's mainly where I am. I don't have an Instagram. I'm not on Facebook. I'm getting a lot of pressure from my audience to to do some more of this stuff. But that's where I am for now. It's mainly just the podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts.
And then how can we find you on YouTube? What's your handle there? Is it Unofficial Guide?
Yeah, you can just look up Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. It should pop right up.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to let you go here, and thank you so much for coming on History and Whatever with a very unserious comic. And I really appreciate your insight and helping me kind of get a little bit better of idea of how to maybe explain some of this to someone else, because it's very difficult, but I feel better about it now.
Okay, well, I'm glad I could help.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much. And hey, I'm looking forward to the next episode of the Unofficial Guide.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
All right. Have a good night, man.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Well, that was a blast. I really enjoyed my conversation with John from Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. And I highly recommend that if you're interested in this kind of thing, that's a great place to go, a great resource to find more books, more ideas on mythology, more context. And he always does a really good job of posting the things that he does the research on in his show notes. And the shows are really great. And you could hear that he's got a great sense of humor. And it's such an honor to have John on from his podcast here on History and Whatever. So that'll be it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, like, subscribe, share, tell your mother, tell your tattoo artist when you're getting your Celtic Norse tattoo or whatever about history and whatever. And we're going to have more variety for you coming up and more history. So thanks for tuning in, you guys. We'll see you next time.